Hello, everybody. Good evening and welcome to this evening's Royal Historical Society lecture. I'm Emma Griffin. I'm the President of the Society, and I'm delighted to open our 2023 programme of lectures and events. Each year, the Society invites historians working across a wide range of chronologies and regions to present and discuss their current research. And tonight, it's my real pleasure to welcome the first of this year's RHS lecturers, the modern Russian historian Sarah Badcock. Sarah is Professor of Modern History at the University of Nottingham and a very well-known and regarded specialist in the history of 19th and 20th century Russia and the Soviet Union. Her research and publications focus in particular on the relationship between individual Russians and the Russian state, exploring the ways by which state power was demonstrated and exerted and the implications of this for everyday human existence, especially in the final decades of Tsarist rule and during the revolution of 1917. The latter was the subject of Sarah's 2014 book, Politics and the People in Revolutionary Russia, which was distinctive in exploring how democratic experiments attempted between February and October 1917 were experienced by ordinary men and women remote from the centres of politics, power and change. Sarah's second book, Prison Without Walls, Eastern Siberian Exile in the Last Years of Tsarism, has continued this focus on provincial Russians' experience of state power, here through the mechanisms of punishment and the meanings for the Siberian prisoner and their families who followed them into exile between 1905 and 1917. More recently, Sarah's work has considered the lives of Russia's rural population through a range of subject approaches, and one of these is age, and specifically the experience of the elderly, and that's the subject of this evening's lecture, Waiting to Die, Life for Elderly People in Late Imperial Russian Villages. Sarah, over to you.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to talk about the experience of older people in late imperial Russian village life. And I mean, I think that we probably understand that elderly people seem to be at the absolute heart and the center of everyday Russian life, sitting on benches in the street, watching the world go by, leading their households, working in the fields, and generally being at the kind of the heart of the hub of the household and the community. And so this is the ways in which the Russian village has been constructed in the way that we've seen it. And I wanted to start by articulating that I am not suggesting that the experience of older people is universal, because it is not. So every individual's experience is framed by their gender, by their wealth, by their privilege, by their race or ethnicity, and by their cultural norms, and then finally by their individual life circumstances. So we cannot make big sweeping generalization about how life was for a particular group of a massive population. And I'm not going to try to do that, but what I'm going to try to do is to pick a little bit of what we might know about the life experience of the elderly, and that my not exactly uplifting title of Waiting to Die, that's a reference to thinking about the very end of life, the advanced stage of old age, if you like. So in my paper today, I'm going to try to cover a core idea, a core story, and a core question. So my core idea, the thing that I'm going to present here, is that I think that the veneer of authority for older people in villages was actually something which obscures the lived experience of the non-able elderly. So the idea of the elders within a community as being the leaders and the people in charge, I'm going to argue that that actually isn't really very compelling, and that if we look at the advanced stages of old age, we see this kind of loss of prestige, authority and presence for older people. So that's my core idea. Then my core story is, well, I'm trying to give us some insights into daily lived experience for older people. I'm going to try to privilege their voices where I can, although that is a challenge given the sources, which I'll explain in a little bit. But that's my aim. But then my core question, and my question I hope will speak to a broader field than just my Russian historian friends. And my core question is about, how does society accord value and worth to individuals? Who matters? How much? And who cares? And so those are the kind of the core ideas. And I suppose that I picked this topic for the Royal Historical Society lecture because I feel that experience of old age is it is a universal. We all, if we get there, we everybody dies. We age, and this experience of aging is culturally constructed. And I think that exploring it in this way helps us understand this community and this society that I'm particularly interested in. And the final point I'd like to make before I go on is just to say that I believe as a scholar that my job actually is not necessarily to know, but rather to articulate doubt. So I'm hoping to kind of shine little funnels of light into these difficult to understand and difficult to access spaces. And I'm not claiming to know everything that happens behind closed doors in private, in intimate spheres, which is where we seek to tread when we look at older people's lived experience, but rather that I'm interested in that exploration, and I'm proud of, I'm okay with the unknowability of the things that I'm interested in exploring. So that's a kind of a little starter. Let's go to our next slide. So I've got here a painting from my favorite artist, Ilya Repin, and a painting depicting my favorite writer, Lev Tolstoy. And Lev Tolstoy, that famous cross-dresser Tolstoy, who loved to pick up the garb of the simple peasant folk, and that wealthy, illustrious, world-acknowledged nobleman would pick up his wooden peasant plough and his simple homespun linens, and he would sometimes plough the fields, and that made him feel at one with the world. He felt that this was a kind of a great connection with the day-to-day, the life of the common people. So I start with that little anecdote about Tolstoy, but I wanted to pick up this idea about visible old age. What kind of old age do we see? And so if we read Tolstoy, I think it's quite a nice way of seeing, I would say quite a typical way of seeing late imperial peasant life, and particularly the position of older people within that. And the quote that I've got here is from the hero of Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina. And Levin, like Tolstoy, liked to get his hands dirty and get his rosy cheeks flushed by picking up a bit of peasant work. And when he was feeling frustrated with the world, he would go in and he wanted to work with his peasants. And so on this particular occasion, he'd been frustrated after an encounter with his brother, and he decided he would go and mow with his peasants. And, he picks up his scythe and joins the gang who are moving in a group across a field, and is completely and totally shattered by this work. But he is simultaneously filled with joy and excitement and a kind of a tranquility which otherwise eludes him. But there's one particular character who who Levin watches and gets into step with. I wanted to just pull out the way in which Tolstoy described him. He said, "The old man, holding himself erect, went in front, moving with long, regular strides, his feet turned out and swinging his scythe as precisely and evenly and apparently as effortlessly as a man swings his arms in walking." And I love this depiction because it really gives us this sense of this elderly man who effortlessly works alongside, in step with the younger men, and indeed does it so easily that he stops in his path and collects mushrooms for his wife, but without breaking stride of this mowing. And I would argue that Tolstoy's old man is really very dominant in our imaginings of the rural spaces. In terms of the way in which village peasant life was constructed, these are patriarchal society, so that gender and generation are what defines hierarchy and prestige within the communities. So in principle, the elder men would be the leaders of the community and would have authority both in the community and in the household, and that women would always be subservient to men, but the older women would be above the hierarchy to younger women. So as female status, I should add, is also connected to child bearing and child rearing, as well as these other factors. So there's the imagining of the older person, which is really quite a positive, rosy image. And I think that what I'm going to try to unpick for you in this paper is that what I've seen in my research is that the incapacity to work, which comes with advanced old age, means that one's status and value and visibility in the community collapses. So that's kind of where I'm coming from. Let's go to our next slide. Okay, so my structure and my key questions. I'm trying to give you a little map so that you can follow me as we go along. I'd like to keep you alongside me in this conversation. It's a very strange conversation to be sitting in the room at the very top of my house with the doors closed to barricade out pets and children, which hopefully is going to work. But I'm trying to imagine you all sitting in front of me now. So I'm going to use these slides and these really powerful visuals, which are roughly contemporaneous to the topic I'm talking about, just to try and keep you along with me so that we know where we are on the page. So what am I going to do? I'm going to start by talking about when old age begins, which is not a straightforward construction. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the place of elderly people in rural life and work, so a useful life, so what kind of work elderly people do. But then I'm going to move on, and for the second part of the paper, I'm going to be looking at the ways in which the elderly who are no longer really fit to work, how they are cared for and who cares for them and whose responsibility they are. So that's the kind of structure. This picture, by the way, this is a peasant painter from the late imperial period called Vasily Maximov, who painted almost exclusively actually peasant life. So there's going to be a few of his. He's quite handy for me because he did paint a lot. He's not nearly as good as Repin, I'm afraid, but his subjects are very pertinent. So there we go. So a little bit of context about late Imperial Russia before I go on. So late Imperial Russia at the turn of the century was often described as a country, a space, an empire in crisis. And that notion of crisis, part of that is something which is constructed, which is placed onto the turn of the century by historians and scholars with our eye forward to the revolution that we know is going to happen. But it's also something which was constructed by contemporaries. So contemporaries in the turn of the century, in late Imperial Russian Empire, they were widely concerned about this notion of Russia in crisis. And there's a whole range of different reasons for why one might imagine Russia to be in crisis at the turn of the century. But the bit I'm going to particularly focus on is Russia's relatively rapid process of urbanization and industrialization. So the serf, the rural peasant population were only emancipated from serfdom in 1861. So it's relatively late. And after 1861, there was really quite a rapid process of industrialization and urbanization in Russia. And although rural spaces continued to be wildly dominant up until well after the revolution, you're talking about more than 80% of the population would be categorized as peasant, still cities grew very fast, and there was really quite high levels of urban to rural mobility. So people were on the move, the printed word was spreading, literacy was rapidly increasing. You've got all the social implications of rural to urban spaces. You've got the spectres of modernity coming to late Imperial Russia. And so with those spectres of modernity and with the cultural change, that provokes these senses of anxiety and crisis. And one of the areas that people were worried about, they're worried about lots of things. They're worried about the kind of songs that rural people were singing, and they were concerned about a degradation of morality, and they were concerned about a loss of an imagined past. But one of the things they worried about was the position of the elderly. And so something that was articulated by commentators at the turn of the century was the idea that the status of elderly people in the villages was reducing, that there was no longer as much respect for old people, and that this was all part of this kind of moral decay of the turn of the century. You probably pick up from my tone that I'm not very convinced by those narratives. I think that they come from kind of imaginings of pre-industrial, pre-modern, pre-urban environments as somehow pristine, idealized. And so I've read I've tried to frame my my readings and my understanding in some of the contemporary, some of the comparative scholarship. So people working on other times and other places on experience of old age, and it seems that the scholarship there is pretty emphatic that these notions of elderly people as privileged in pre-industrial, pre-modern spaces is actually it is an imagining. It's not a reality, and that in fact ambivalent attitudes towards the elderly are enduring through the long durée of our historical understanding in Western, Central and Eastern Europe. So what the scholarship, I think, as indicates to me is this kind of incorporation of the sort of, on the one hand, kind of respect for wisdom, respect for the elderly, and on the other hand, a kind of pity and even revulsion at the inexorable process of aging. So that's the kind of comparative frame. The historiography on old age is relatively young, in that if we contrast it with the history of childhood, which has been an emerging and I think developed now discipline, we'll see a very, very rich array of resources that have come up around history and experience of childhood. History and experience of old age, there is a wonderful scholarship there, but it's relatively small, and it continues, that tends to be a lack of emphasis on end of life and on the non-able elderly. So those are some areas which are quite challenging to manage. So the final thing I'd like to say before I go on to my discussion of when old age might begin is to just talk a little bit about my key source. So I've made various arch remarks about the challenges of the materials that we might use to understand these questions. And that's partly because late Imperial Russian rural spaces did not have a strong tradition of ego documents. So there isn't a huge wealth of memoir material. There is some, but there isn't a lot. That most of the sources and resources about old age in Russian rural spaces are heavily mediated. The sources that I've chosen to use for this particular survey are primarily around a huge ethnographic effort that was made at the turn of the century, so between about 1898 and 1901, by an amateur ethnographer called Prince Tenishev. And Tenishev decided that he wanted to know about Russian rural spaces in central and northern parts of European Russia. And so he sent out surveys, very detailed questionnaires, and paid people to fill them in. And what he got was thousands of responses, and the responses came from a very diverse array of contributors. Some of them were professional ethnographers. Some of our most prolific contributors to Tenishev are professional ethnographers, that is elite, highly educated people who are presenting themselves as abstracted from the communities that they are observing and commenting on. But lots and lots and lots of the Tenishev material came from people who were of a humble background themselves, that is peasants themselves or children of peasants, peasant teachers, sons and daughters of priests. They were mostly men, but what we do see is it was an extremely rich, diverse, complex set of responses. And while we certainly need to be aware of who wrote them and what they were writing them for, equally, they do, I think, provide us with some really interesting ways into this sort of difficult space of what happens behind closed doors, what happens in the intimate spaces of the village. So that's my structure. I'm going to go on to my next slide. I'm imagining you all sitting there nodding sagely or making little notes. We'll keep with that. Right. So first thing, when does old age begin? Well, I'm sure some of you, or certainly I feel reassured to discover that chronological age, which is our age as related to our birthday, is not necessarily a good or useful indicator of what old age is or was. So in the materials that I've utilised, there tends to be an emphasis more on what I describe as functional old age than on chronological old age. So the date at which you were born and your actual age is less important than your capacity to work. So and that can vary enormously. So I have a little case study here from Yaroslav province in Ivantseva village. There were two Kapralovs. I don't know if they were brothers, they probably were though, but we've got Vasily Mikhailovich Kapralov, who was 65, and he did everything. He cut wood for sale, he sowed, he reaped, he thrashed his own wheat, he was the leader of his household, very busy 65-year-old, fully in control of his community and his family. Alexei Mikhailovich Kapralov was 56, but was completely incapacitated, and because of decrepitude, a word which is really exclusively about old age, at 56 he was completely unable to work and had to give back his little plot of land because he wasn't fit to work it. My little example is just to remind us that those numbers, the age that you are, doesn't define what your old age is. Your old age is about what you can do rather than what age you are. And certainly that's something which we sort of 21st century denizens are increasingly conscious of, as the notion of what old is slips and shifts from one generation to the next. If you want a number, they're talking about 60 to 70 as a working number across a wide range of contexts. And again, based on my a survey of the comparative literature looking at other contexts, that seems to be quite familiar numbers. So these kind of 60 to 70 is the kind of number. There's a gendered factor to that. Women would tend to be described as no longer fit for a full range of physical work earlier, but they tended to live longer. Another factor to kind of just mention is that those individuals who practiced migrant labour, that is, worked in urban spaces and came back into rural spaces, that there was a general consensus that working in urban spaces aged you prematurely and hard, and that was a reflection of extremely tough working conditions, often in Russia's urban industrial spaces. So a final point for this this discussion is just to bear in mind the demographics. So Russia has really low life expectancy figures at the turn of the 20th century. That doesn't mean that there weren't very many old people around. It means that there was phenomenally high infant mortality. And so I can discuss that at length, but I'm going to duck away from those slides and charts and just reassure you that people did reach old age, and they did so routinely, but that's not necessarily, it doesn't necessarily show up on average ages because of the very high rates of child mortality. Oh, and a final note, I make the absolute most of having an audience to show Repin paintings. Isn't this one beautiful? So this is Repin's mother, Tatiana Repina, who was a hardworking, self-educated woman who educated her own children and was an all-round awesome lady. She was 56 in this painting, and I think she would probably already be considered pretty old. But I love the capacity of Repin to offer us humanity and a vivid living individual. So that's what I leave you with on this slide. So before I go on to kind of think about how older people were cared for and that kind of thing, I wanted to just try and frame, well, where were they in village life while they were present, while they were active? And so I've already mentioned that older people would have been considered to be the heads of the household. They would be the dominant decision makers in the community and in their families. But apart from those kind of leadership roles, what else have we got? So I thought I would kind of think about it in terms of the older person as a placeholder of an imagined past. That was my way of understanding it. By the way, this painting on the side here, this is another Maximov, and it's called Grandmother's Tales. Apparently Tretyakov, who bought it from Maximov, on closer inspection, he really disliked the painting of there's a woman nursing a baby to one side of the picture, and Tretyakov was very unimpressed with the painting of the hand and arm and urged the painter to repaint it and think again. So anyway, but placeholders of an imagined past, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that the very presence of elderly and older people within the community were a very visceral reminder of one's past. So the elder generation were the survivors of serfdom. They lived in a different world. They'd been involved in a different environment. And so what could they offer you? They could offer you a reminder of your past, and they could do it just by their very presence, but they could do it also because they tell stories, they tell tales. And the elders were really held up in high regard as storytellers. So I particularly like this picture for that reason. What other roles do they play, though? So something which came up again and again in the ethnographic material that I read was the idea of older people as a brake on progress. The idea that all kinds of progress and change and newness in the villages was something which was always being pushed against by the elder generation. And I'm not totally convinced by this. I'm sure that there were examples of one and the other, but there we are. I will give you a lovely little anecdote, though. I do like to try and find these older people's voices. They are few and far between, so I will share them when I can find them. So we've got an 80-year-old fellow in Novgorod province who believed that tooth problems were a result of pampering. And he said, earlier, we never heard of any kind of tooth illnesses. The people were stronger. And stronger from what? Less pampering. That tea that we've read about, that wasn't even heard of 50 years ago. In our whole village of 70 people, there was only one samovar, that's a water boiler, at Yonov's. But now every last homeless fellow sups tea, rinsing his teeth and rinsing his belly. And this is a little harmless anecdote from an elder gentleman berating the youth for their softness. And this is something which you will see, and I'm sure it feels quite familiar, the idea of the weakening of the youth and the lack of resilience among the younger generations. I think that these are relatively predictable repeating tropes in societies and cultures, this idea that the younger generations are somehow less able or less adept than the elders. But you know, that's one of the kind of functions of older people within these communities is taking these roles or being offered these roles. So these questions about moral arbiters, whether it's about spoiling, but you also get tales about dancing. So apparently it's often the case that older people were identified as disapproving of some more modern forms of dance, in particular the so-called squatting dance, where the young men would squat down on their heels and kick like devils, and this was considered to be communing with the devil was the ways in which it was constructed. But whereas kind of more peaceable dancing was, as one elderly man said in Novgorod province, God is with them, the old men say. There is no sin here. So this idea of elderly people as moral arbiters, I think, is quite interesting. Another area, obviously, of moral arbiter was in upholding and practicing religion. So I love this quote which said, on the religious festivals, the old pray and the young stroll, or you know, they go a flirting, and this idea that the elderly within the community are the ones who are upholding religious practice, and certainly that's something which is enduring and repeating, these narratives about the churches being less populated by youth, but that the elderly, particularly elderly women, are the ones who are most likely to fill the church benches, that they're most likely to practice thoroughly, that they will prostrate themselves in full in the church, and that they're more likely to practice Lent, and you know, a whole range of kind of everyday lived religious experience is something which is dominated by the elders and the older people within the community. So the final bit that I wanted to kind of mention on this section was about the idea of the elders as a force that was conflicting with modernity, that was hostile to it. And I'm not suggesting that I believe that to be true, but rather that was the way in which elderly people were often framed and constructed within rural society. So, having talked about their kind of place more broadly. I'm going to talk in a little bit more detail and go back to my Tolstoyan model of that assertive, hale old man striding across the fields, mowing with ease. So we're going to think about work. And I'm going to do another little anecdote because I'm trying to hang this around anecdotes just to keep you guys interested. So in Karotov village, there's an 80-year-old man called Grigori, and he works on a par at every task with his son and his grandson. He ploughs and he mows and he hammers in the forge. And once the priest met Grigori mowing in the field, and he said to him, "You've done your time, Grigori. It's time to give it up." And Grigori answered, "Well, father, as I keep up with the scything in the row, so I do not lag behind at the table." Now, you can take that as a very sort of sweet and charming apocryphal tale. I hear, and this is based on the other material I've read, I hear a sort of a sinister undertone there. If you want to eat, you need to work. So the need to, the evidence that we see here is that that older people ate less, and that they were harassed at the dinner table for eating too much and for taking more than was their due. And this is particularly the case in periods of dearth or famine, or reduction of resources, and particularly the case in less well-off households, as you would expect. But it seems to be a fairly steady buzz and undertone in the narratives about food and the table, is a kind of a tension between the older and the younger generations about how much you eat. So in accounts asking about what old people chat about, this is one of the common things that older people speaking among themselves would discuss. How is it in your house? Do they harass you? Do they make you work harder than you want to? Do you get fed? And again, you know, that was, so the comment that I've got here, quoted down again from one of these ethnographic sources, is, "That'll do you. You don't work much." And the son berates his father, "You've scooped the beef out of the soup. Now I'm eating empty soup. You eat, you don't work, but you're the first to eat." And I think this gives us a little vivid flash of Grigori at the table, who can eat along with his son and his grandson because he works. And so this kind of takes us towards these ideas about, well, what is the value? What's the cultural value of an individual life? How do we rank them? So in terms of what kinds of jobs that older people did in the community, I've already mentioned that older people would have been prominent in leading their household, and certainly for women who were no longer fit to manage the often very, very hard physical labour that was connected with agricultural tasks, that she might then take on the running of the household, so the cooking, the caring for the stove, which is a very important role, and bossing around the younger women in the household, ensuring that everything runs smoothly. But then apart from those roles around running household, there would also be very specific crafts and skills that older people would be in possession of, which maybe younger people didn't have. So, I mean, the ones I saw in particular was the weaving of bast shoes, which now only the old people can do. There's some very specific spinning and weaving tasks, which again, it was noted that only the older ladies could still do those things, and they were really respected and needed. Beekeeping actually was another job that was regarded as a skilled older man's job. So those are the kind of jobs that that sort of show a certain prestige and authority within your community and your household, the thing that you can do that no one else can do. But we also have a whole set of less taxing jobs, which are the jobs for the weak, and usually they would be bracketed in for the old, the infirm, elderly, and children. And that would, and they were, it's not that they weren't important jobs, but that they were jobs that required less physical strength and capacity. In particular, market gardening, so looking after the household plot, growing and picking fruits and vegetables and berries in the right seasons. care for infants. And for those of us who have ever cared for an infant, we will acknowledge that that is not a job for the weak, but it was construed as such. Care for infants was considered to be the job that the very elderly infirm person could be getting on with. So those are the kind of jobs that older people do, and that again trying to give us a sense of what kind of status position older people had within their communities. So I've tried to lay out then a little bit about the kind of external, what did older people do, where were they seen, how were they seen. Now I'm going to go into that final part of my lecture where I'm going to talk more about the behind closed doors part of older life and older care. And so this first slide, which is asking who cares. So the first thing I need to clarify is that care for parents was a core filial expectation. So it was very widely accepted and understood. You know, if you don't care for your parents, nothing good will ever come to you. And these ideas certainly were very, very strongly reinforced in a whole range of different cultural spaces in late Imperial Russian village. You can see, therefore, that the childless were particularly vulnerable. So if you were without children, but not only am I going to explore the situation for the childless, although I'm also going to explore the limitations of those expectations of care, because based on the material that I've seen and my reading of it, I would argue that, in fact, the requirement and expectation of children to care for parents was, in practice, very limited. So before I go on to that, just to point out, really clarify, turn of the century Russia. There's no universal public welfare, there's no pension. And to put that into comparative framework, Denmark had a pension in 1891, Germany in 1889, New Zealand in 1898, UK and Australia introduced a limited old age pension in 1908. So it's around this time that some level of, like, absolutely bottom level of kind of network of support for the elderly and vulnerable was being introduced in parts of Europe and the British Empire. There were some Russian almshouses in urban areas, very, very limited, almost nothing in rural areas, and the coverage of the urban almshouses again would be very, very low. So what you're looking at then is just to reiterate that for the rural elderly, care had to come from the family or the community. There wasn't another option. So my questions here are, well, children are expected to provide for their parents, do they? And then what kind of support comes from the community for their vulnerable members? So that's my bit. So what about so then this slide is really about asking you, can we find some agency for older people? So I'm talking about them being cared for, which sounds like they become these passive, submissive members of their community being passed around. There is some of that, absolutely. But I suppose I wanted to see, how do elder people try to manage their care? And they do try. What you see is that property and inheritance were things that could be used by older people to encourage children to care appropriately for them, or to encourage a named other person, that is a non-family member, to care for them if necessary. So in principle, the elder male within a community, within a family, would control decisions to divide a household. And this picture from Maximov called Household Division is showing the challenging moment where the younger, the son and the son's wife has demanded that the household be divided and that they leave the household with some possessions and set up a separate household. So turn of the century Russia, there was a shift from extended families living in a single unit towards more nuclear families. So there was some breakdown, but there was a mixed pattern, and it did vary from region to region. But in principle, the elder would control the division. He would decide who could stay and who could go. But as one son said, he said, of course, according to the rule, it would be impossible to go against the old man. But because he won't get off the stove and go to the community gathering, well, you do exactly as you want. Now, I think that's quite a penetrating comment, because it reiterates my suspicion that as the elder becomes less able, as the elder is less likely to participate in community activity and community politics, so that person's capacity and power within the community and within the family is reduced. So there are things that elder people, even if they are being overruled, can do to try to protect and control these environments. So one of the things you can do is you can write a will, and they did use wills to try to offer reward and compensation to family members who committed to caring for them until they died, and then offering them a decent burial. And so this is the wording in the will is, he'll feed and water me till I die, and then he will bury and remember me. And this kind of construction would be used within a will testament to try to privilege maybe an individual child who would take on responsibility for your care. It could also be used to adopt somebody. So for a couple who didn't have a son, they could try to adopt their brother, either their brother-in-law or their son-in-law, if they had one, and they could adopt them. So they could bring them into the household, and they could offer them the opportunity to inherit the entire property when they died, on condition that they would be cared for. And so this, again, you can see that there's a certain quite intelligent use of resource. You know, if you have something, then you can offer it in an attempt to ensure that you're provided for at the very end of your life. You could also adopt somebody who is totally unrelated to you, again, on the provision that they would care properly for you until you died, and then they would bury you and honour you, and they could have your property. So these are the ways that elderly people had to potentially control and manage their end-of-life care. So that's the sort of the kind of how they might manipulate the family. What about the community, though? So how would, so I mean, I've mentioned that it was an expectation that children care for their parents. Who polices that? Who decides? There is no formalized construction which enforces those sorts of behaviors. They are culturally constructed practices. The evidence that I have is that there were some soft interventions, that is that accounts where, you know, where an elderly parent was not being cared for very well, that the neighbours would drop in and care for her, maybe offer food, maybe offer some washing and assistance, and that the errant child, the son or the daughter who was not caring adequately for this parent, would face disapproval from the community, but nothing else. So I've got a little account here. So in Gridino village in Novgorod province, there was an old woman who had 2 sons, and she was sent to live with one of them when the property was divided. So as a woman, she didn't have control over the property. So when the property is divided, she is allocated to one of her children. The son and his wife treated her very cruelly and left her lying on the stove for days, sometimes without food. The other son refused to intervene because he said it was not his responsibility. The neighbours dropped food for the old woman and reproached the son, but no action was taken. This is an interesting example then of the way in which the community, it's what I would describe as leaning in a little bit, but not too far. So they're not taking legal action against the son who is in breach of his filial regulation, but they are putting a little bit of pressure on him and trying to offer some support. So it's an example then of a community which is interested and engaged in care for the elderly. For the childless, for those who don't have, who maybe didn't have the resources to adopt a person to care for them, or who don't have children of their own for other reasons. So there's quite a lot of variance in the reports about how communities offer some degree of support to the vulnerable elderly who don't have support. So some describe the whole community sharing in the provision of food and fuel, that is, you know, sort of heating materials for elderly vulnerable people. And this is quite a nice warm idea. We also have examples of cells, so that is extremely simple, basic, small dwellings being provided by the church, and that these cells provided very, very basic living space for the vulnerable elderly, and that alms would be provided by worshippers for these elderly people, usually cash, and that it would be left on a special window of the cell. So there was a place where you could leave money without opening the door. And so I thought that was quite an interesting ways in which the community could adapt to provide a degree of support for the very vulnerable elderly. That wasn't universal though, and I saw very varied pictures from village to village. And to kind of reinforce that, to reiterate, and this ties in with this beautiful painting from Perov called The Wanderer, painted a little earlier than my bit in 1869. But begging was absolutely entrenched in rural society. It was considered to be a sin not to provide alms to people who come and ask for it, and that's tied into Russian Orthodox faith, the need to give. And so there are accounts of that households would always save any hopeless crust of bread, and they might even dry it out in the oven, so that even if they themselves were needy, that there was always something to give to somebody who comes and asks for help. The accounts about begging in rural communities are that the beggars were absolutely overwhelmingly dominated by childless elderly. The exact group you might imagine who would be looking quite vulnerable in these societies. These are the people who are going door to door and begging, and some of them were absolutely vagrant poor. That is, they might even have been moving from village to village, and they might not have settled accommodation. You know also that very impoverished families, if they had to send family members out to beg, they would send the very elderly and their children. So that to me tells us that the very elderly are regarded as subjects for pity, and that they're worthy recipients of resources from the community. So that's some thoughts on that. So I've talked then about the background, about care more broadly, about care in the community. I'm now moving on to what I would describe as really behind closed doors. Who cares in the family? What happens at the end? Because when you reach advanced old age without any kind of medical intervention and support, then very often you're going to become extremely decrepit. And the accounts of end of life, that the extremely elderly, is that they are entirely housebound, and that they are often left alone in the home, especially in the busy times of year, especially in summer. And so this slide really then comes back to the beginning of my talk, and this question about waiting to die. Who cares in the end? Who looks after you? How are you cared for? Again, just to reiterate something which I said earlier, so just as with almshouses, hospitals are extremely rare in these contexts, and hospitals were regarded with grave suspicion by older people. There's a beautiful Chekhov short story actually, where the old lady who is dying and she's taken to the hospital by the penitent husband who'd been treating her absolutely appallingly right through her life. But the idea of the hospital is actually the place where you go to die, and she actually died on her way to the hospital. So hospitals are rare, and they're not a common thing. So elderly people die at home, and they usually die alone at home. And we meet a range of attitudes and experiences and encounters when we try to penetrate those internal spaces. What happens in the home? What happens to those elderly people who are out of view? They are not visible. They are not sitting on street corners. They are not chatting in public places. They are not, they're not hale and hearty and ploughing the fields. They are inside their homes. They are often on the stove. You may have heard me use that phrase several times, and that's, if you're not familiar with it, that is because in Russian peasant hut, the usual thing would be a very, very large stove, which would be the heart of the home. And the family, some or even all of the family, would sleep on top of the stove, where it's very warm and comfortable. And so you often hear references to elderly people who can't get off the stove, and they spend long periods there. So the attitudes that I've encountered on exploring the care for the decrepit elderly, the people at the end of their lives, it's a range of attitudes, and it goes from respectful, loving care all the way to life-shortening abuse. So you see a full spectrum of encounter. The rationale for why do we care or not care for the elderly in the ways that we do, it varies from the philosophical, which is they've had their time, and you often hear little anecdotes and insights which reinforce that idea. Oh, grandma, you've been here 300 years. It's time for you to die. This is the kinds of quotes that you'll see around this. So you've got these philosophical ideas about that you've lived your life, you're finished, and it's time to die. Then you've got the practical ones, which is we just don't have time to care for you because we have to go out and do this field work, which is, you know, a reasonable point. And then finally, you've got the economic rationale, which is we've got no time and we've got no resources to care for a family member who is not productive. And those connections between productivity and worth are explicitly made, which are difficult, I think, for a modern audience. I certainly had to read again and look again when I saw those. So I'm going to just read an account which I thought was quite a powerful one, which he says, for the sick here in general, death is very bad and sometimes remains altogether out of sight. In the summertime, for example, in work time, a ladle of water is left with the patient and they're left alone for the whole day. Decrepit old people are left especially often. Here in the village, a decrepit old woman who was quite unable to move lay alone in the hut for days, and in the end she died on her own. When the family returned from work, they found her already dead. And so actually haven't talked about Tolstoy's attitudes about peasant death, which is a whole separate paper, which I'm looking forward to. But these ideas of peasant death being simple and good and painless, they are just constructions. In practice, elderly people struggled at the very end of their lives. So if I go on to my final slide, oh, I'm bang on time as well, very good. So my final slide, and this is a beautiful photograph. So this is, if you're not familiar with this collection, I really urge you to have a look at it. It's fully available on the Library of Congress website. This is by a chemist and photographer called Mikhail Pradukin-Gorsky, and he photographed the very wide range of different places and spaces in the Russian Empire at the turn of the century, and he used color plates. So this is not being colorized. This is the original painting. So what do I come from then with my insights into this topic? I thought that this idea about invisible old age was quite interesting, thinking about the people on the very edges of society and community and the ways in which they can fade from view. And I think that less able older people are fading to the very edges of what we know and understand about village life. I think that the topic concentrates the mind on the ideas about what human value looks like, and who is regarded as worthy, and where individuals are within social hierarchies, and the extent to which that's indicated by ableness, that is, by active current contribution. I also want to point out that I think that considering this is pushing at the very edges of what we can know. And that is because I am longing to step through the doors of those huts, which incidentally in winter would not just be cozy, they would be utterly, utterly dark, because in order to insulate them from the cold, they would be surrounded by rubble and straw. Any windows would be boarded. The whole thing would take on the feeling of a kind of a dark, grubby womb, and so the elderly people who were housebound in that context would not have seen the sun for months and months and months, and that really caused me to reflect on what the experience of extreme old age would feel like in these contexts. I can't give any absolute concrete answers to that, but I think that asking the question and exploring these edges of Russian rural everyday life can help us reflect about what it means to be human in these contexts.
Thank you, Sarah, so much. That was such an interesting talk. Old age is something that's obviously partially familiar to all of us in some way or another, but taking us out into rural Russia means we need to put what we know into the context of something that we don't know at all. And it's so interesting and it raises so many questions. So thank you very, very much indeed. We are going to, I should have said on introducing Sarah, our format is to allow our speaker to speak for an hour. We then take a 5-minute break and we come back for questions, and there is a Q&A. I can see many people have already know how we work. We've got a Q&A, we have a chat, but it's hard to keep track of the questions in the chat. So please take the most of our 5-minute break to put your questions into the Q&A. Come back in 5 minutes, which will be about 3 or 4 minutes past the hour, and I will then start feeding your questions to Sarah. So see you all very shortly. And Sarah, brilliant paper. Thank you very much indeed. See you in a moment as well. Brilliant. Well, again, thank you for that paper. Questions are definitely coming in, and I will start putting some questions to you. I do sometimes group the questions together, and there are 2 questions around disability. They're slightly different, so I'm gonna, but I'll put them to you together. So one is from Nick, says, very interesting talk, thank you. It sounds to me like you were talking about the status of disabled people and ableism within this society, but without actually using the word. Disabled isn't a bad word, unable sounds like a euphemism. But I mean, I think the question here is, what is this kind of the dividing line between, you know, I'm asking you to say a little bit more about your definition of old age and how that aligns or not with disability. And there's another question that I'd also like to put, which is slightly different, from Anna Whale, saying, how do the experiences of old age compare to the experiences of disability across the age spectrum? So very similar thoughts there, but coming at a slightly different angle around the relationship between old age and disability and your work.
Thank you. So those are great questions. Thank you. I am tussling with this. So I've given a paper related to this at a specialist conference, and it was actually on a disability panel with others, with specialists in disability studies, and we discussed the ways in which disability might intersect with these understandings of old age, and I chose not to use that word today, and I did it deliberately because I am not an expert on disability studies, and I like to take care and make sure that I'm fully up to date with what I'm trying to say. But my understanding was that the social construction of disability is a social construct, you know, that about society and legislation limiting the things that you say you can that you can do, then that didn't apply very well in my context. Another reason I chose not to use disability as a word is because it was never used in that context. I never heard it. It wasn't the ways in which older people described themselves or were described. So the words that I used, which are quite unpleasant words, actually, decrepit, is the word which is used in the texts. And it doesn't necessarily have a connotation of disability, although it may. So I think that the first question there, which is a great question about, come on, Sarah, you could use the word disability. There's nothing wrong with that word. I agree. And yet I'm cautious about it, because I would need to be much more careful about the way in which I framed it, particularly as I understand it, it was not a contemporary understanding of old age. So that's my my answer, which is a little bit of a fudge, but certainly thank you for it. I will continue to push at that and to think about it. And I think that a sub question which that person was asking me was about, well, what about the experience of younger people who were disabled in various ways? And I would guess, I mean, I haven't explored it myself, I would guess that some aspects of their experience would be related to the experience of the elderly, but that it would not necessarily be contiguous. And so I'd be cautious and step back from it, and I would want to unpick it a little bit more before I'd be saying anything confident. Anna's question, which is about, let me think, it was how old age relates to, what was it? What did she
Sorry,
say?
I've moved it. It was, how does it compare with disability? How does old age compare with disability?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think as a novice in disability studies, a raw novice in disability studies, what I was struck by was how diverse the definitions and ways of understanding what disabled might be, and therefore, again, it's a bit of a fudgy answer, but that I don't feel it's I don't feel I can make any easy comparisons, because I'm not sure that what disabled was in this context is something that I can adequately encapsulate and just crisply get.
Yeah, in fact, I mean, I think that is a really interesting point itself, that disability is a concept that maybe isn't fully formulated in this scenario. Old age certainly is. Fascinating stuff, Sarah, thank you. I'm going to again put two questions together. So Dmitry Ivanov says, thank you very much, very interesting. Wanted to ask if the material collected is focused specifically on quotation marks ethnic Russian peasantry, or are there also bits of other groups creeping in? Because Repin's family was born from, I can't pronounce that word, Troishiev, and some of your earlier work deals with non-Russian peasantry in the Volga region. And I'll also just throw in the first question from Jeff, who described himself as an opera addict. Were Jews included in the survey? So
thank you, Dmitry and Jeff. Those are both excellent points. I didn't do a good enough job of explaining it at the outset. The Tenishev survey is very irritating in this respect, in that it very deliberately excluded anyone who is not ethnically Russian. So it's a very limiting tool in that respect. So it doesn't talk about Imperial Russian, which is this extraordinary melting pot of ethnicities and cultures and diversities. It talks about ethnic Russians. So for that reason, it doesn't do much or anything with Kazan, which Kazan has a big Tatar population. It focuses on the areas which are where ethnic Russians are dominant. And in answer to Jeff's question about the Jewish involvement, so as you probably know, that in late Imperial Russia there was a series of legislation which explicitly controlled and persecuted the Jewish population. So the Jewish population were not officially allowed to live in rural spaces outside the Pale of Settlement, which is in the western parts of Russia. These surveys weren't looking at those regions, so there would have been no Jewish engagement in this survey. For Jeff's, if it's at all useful or interesting, there's a wonderful survey of, sorry, I'm going to completely the opposite end of the demographic spectrum now, but it's a really interesting article about child mortality rates and looking at different ethnic groups, and they find that among the Jewish community, the child mortality rates are abruptly better. That is, children survive much better and much longer, and that's because within those communities, women were encouraged and expected to breastfeed exclusively for long periods, and that meant that children didn't die. The reason I'm giving you that little nugget is to say that I think that these spaces would be culturally defined, and it might well be that if we were to look into a Jewish community, we may well find a completely different set of expectations around care for the elderly. So these are cultural constructs, I think, that I'm talking about. And so to go back to Dmitry, no, it's not about the Tatars in Kazan. So I am looking at these ethnic Russian groups, which is both limiting, but also lets me have something to say just about them.
Yeah, thank you. So fascinating. And Isabella Gorska says, I'm curious, what kind of resources did you rely on when conducting this research? So clearly the survey that you've mentioned is a core source. Is there anything else that you think that's out there that historians could look at?
Yeah, I mean, I think that what I've been doing is so as my audience probably knows, access to Russian-based archives is not an option at all today or in the future as we stand now. And so what I would have loved to do if Russia were not engaged in a violent and illegal war against Ukraine is I would have loved to spend time in archives, regional archives in Russia, to explore some of those village records and documents. But without those things, then what I will do is I'll use literary and ethnographic, and I will use published memoirs, and I'll use anything I can get my sticky mitts on, really. So it'll be, you know, that there are newspaper collections which have been digitized, some of which may have some material which will be useful. That, as I say, there's memoirs, ethnographies. So and then there were, you know, right, and actually some of the artists, so that particularly Ryepin and Maximov, both depict the rural spaces, and so I think that you can use them not as an exclusive resource, but as a window, as a moment, as a way in. So
yeah, thanks Sarah. So another range of questions, I'll break them up a little bit because I think they're well, it's also interesting and it deserves its own space. So Nick asks, we know that currently across pretty much all societies the majority of the caring responsibilities fall to women. Was this the case at this time in Russia? Or was it a society where everyone was working in some form or other who could? Did this mean that the caring responsibilities were actually more evenly shared across gender divides? I think that's a fascinating thought, because of course your work patterns are very different out there. Yeah, it's
a great question, Nick. I wish I could answer it differently, but I'm afraid that you would find that those spaces of care would be exclusively female providers. I would expect that. So sort of there were fairly clearly demarcated spheres of authority within rural communities, and women would have control and autonomy over the stove, the cooking, the cleaning, and care. And I would expect care to be something which was very gendered. I have seen a number of accounts of sons and men being responsible for and caring for an elder parent, but I'm afraid that it's the nature of the materials I'm looking at is that they are unfailingly negative. That is, son is looking after father so badly that father was very badly injured. So those are the only accounts that I've seen which refer to male caregiving. My assumption would be, it tends to be a huge double burden which endures in Russian society. So Russian women, I would think, would have been expected to do all the work and then some.
Yeah, so funny that we go all the way across the world and so many different ways of organising societies, but the care is always the women's work, no matter where you go. So fascinating. And a slightly different take on the gender question comes from Christina von Hodenberg. Hi, Christina, lovely to see you here. Are there instances of elderly men or women demanding better care and speaking out against being let down by family and community? Are men more likely to protest than old women? As she adds, by the way, the picture for old people in Germany is very dissimilar, very different.
Interesting.
But I thought that is interesting about not just who's providing the care, but the men and the elderly men and women receiving the care. Is there a gendered story that side?
Yeah, well, so I was surprised by what I found in my material, which is that I didn't see a lot of gender divide. And what I saw, which I think I referred to very briefly in the abstract of this talk, is a certain desexing that one's gender, when you reach the advanced state of needing care, that your gender becomes less important. The question of whether people who would protest. I do hear frustrated voices, complaining voices in my sources, but I would not use the word protest, probably, because protest would require a degree of potential for power, potential for action. And the challenge for these elder people is that they are disempowered, that they are marginalized. They do complain. So I've got some very sad accounts of elderly people really berating their care, their status, their inability to effect a good outcome for themselves at the end of their lives. So one old man says, and men and women speaking as well, I'm not. I think that the gender hierarchy actually somehow fuzzies and fades as power leaves this group. But this elderly man speaking to an ethnographer and saying, how could this ever have happened to me? I even set up my will so it would be okay, and now they just abuse and neglect me. So you do get these voices. And one of the sources that I found really interesting was accounts of chat. What do old people chat? When people so there was a whole section of questions about what words do people use when they meet each other on the street. And then there'd be a whole subsection about how old people would meet each other and greet each other on the street. And that would go in then to their first comments. So what would you ask about? How are you doing? Are they working you too hard? Do you get fed? And these little anecdotes and little woes that would come up, they really hit you with this kind of frustrated, a kind of a cry of protest, I guess.
Fantastic, thank you, Sarah. So Mary O'Dowd's question again pushes, I mean, you may feel that you said everything that you have to say on gender difference, but just another nice angle from Ireland this time. Great. Thanks for a great talk and great images. I quite agree. There are striking similarities with the elderly in rural Ireland in the 19th century, where begging was also core to the care for the elderly, but it was often older women who were sent out to beg, as the men were ashamed to do so. I wondered if you could say more about gender differences. And I'd just like to throw my own point that I think you're right that there's a kind of a flattening of the difference between men and women, arguably, when somebody's unable to earn and unable to work, then that hierarchy starts to break down a little bit, which I hadn't really thought about, but it's really fascinating. You see it in early childhood as well, I think, where boys and girls both go barefoot and hungry until they can earn, and there's this kind of flattening. But
yeah, no, absolutely. So thank you, Mary, for that comment. I'll be interested to hear and think more about elderly in rural Ireland in the 19th century. It wouldn't surprise me that much if there were some commonalities there. In terms of men and women begging, I think that it's connected with the practice of the Russian Orthodox Church, that I think that begging is not seen as particularly shameful. And so you definitely would see men begging, and that would be, I didn't see any account of a gender difference in begging. I will check because it's interesting, but I didn't see it. And you notice the picture I showed the pair of as a male beggar, and I would almost say that the dominant image would probably be a male beggar. It'd be a really quite a common image.
Fantastic, thank you. Eliza asks, so as change of tack here, again, really interesting. What was the support for autocracy like amongst the elderly Russian peasants? And I'd be interested in flipping that around a little bit. What kind of support could elderly Russian peasants get from, outside? You've said there's no formal support, but are there kind of informal charities or other ways in which social elites could offer some form of support? Or
yeah, okay, it's a great question, Eliza. Thank you. So I like to flip this around because I get asked a lot about it in relation to the revolutionary period, and well, who cares? And I suppose that I'm very, very reluctant to posit many opinions about how older people felt about autocracy, because our sources are so very, very limited. And so even if we were looking at so for a long time, I think historians may have slightly misread the language of petition. So when there's a strong tradition of direct petitioning to the autocrat from rural societies, the idea that you can cut through the maelstrom of petty bureaucracy and speak directly to the man in charge, and that things will then be fixed. And the language of those petitions would be absolutely prostrating oneself before the great leader, your little father Tsar, who you believe in absolutely. And so there's all this kind of I mean, I'm hesitating. I'd use the word guff around. But what you see in the revolutionary period is that people adopt the language of power incredibly effectively. So, in the pre-revolutionary period, when the autocrat is the lord of all he surveys, then it is appropriate to use this obsequious language when describing yourself to him. Equally, in 1917, when the autocrat has abdicated, you then use the rights, the language of rights and privileges, which has come in with the February Revolution. Snap, just like that. You adopt the language of power. So peasants can speak to power, and they can do it very effectively. And so what they say when they speak to power doesn't necessarily tell us how they feel. It tells us that they're good at speaking to power. And that's a rather long-winded way of saying that I'd be very hesitant about it'd be very easy to say, oh, yes, well, older people, they believed in the Tsar. And well, they might have done, but then they certainly didn't come out in their hordes in February of 1917 to protest against the abdication. There was not a whisper from the villagers when Nicholas II abdicated. And that leaves me to believe that popular support for autocracy was probably fairly limited.
That's so interesting. Thank you, Sarah. Question from Alyssa Klotz. Thank you for the talk. It seems like in any decade of Russian Soviet history, older women in the countryside are overrepresented amongst active churchgoers. I should say we're pivoting towards religion here. And the assumption that I often encounter is that these women were more religious because they are old. People used to be more religious, and so they're just continuing in the tradition. And it seems to me that these women, especially in the later decades of the 20th century, turned to the church in their old age. I wonder if you could speak to the place of older women in religious practice. Was there something that made the church particularly attractive or welcoming to older women?
That's a really interesting question, Alyssa. I don't have a satisfactory answer to it because I don't know. But it's definitely the case if you look at the late Soviet and particularly the early post-Soviet period, you do see these images, and I saw them as a young graduate and postdoctoral student in Russia, that the churches were filled with older women, and you see men much less in those spaces. In the late imperial period that I'm talking about, you did see that women were always the leaders in religious practice and devotion. Why that is difficult to say. There was a whole generation of hostile anti-church propaganda which argued that it was because women were ignorant, which we don't really subscribe to. But it's certainly the case that religion was regarded as a space of contemplation, of safety, of security, of comfort, of reassurance. I don't know, because I haven't studied that in depth in itself, but I do think it's a really interesting question. I did see that, again, the material that I saw provided evidence that men and women of the older generation were the ones who were most likely to practice, but that women were more likely than men to fill the church. So it's the same kind of bias towards female practice that you identify is what I would say.
Yeah, so interesting, isn't it? Nicholas Cambridge. Hello, Nicholas. Good to see you here as well. What medical care was available? Did the families have recipe books to make medicines? Do you know anything about this?
That's a good question. So there was there was folk medicine, and there was sort of domestic medical experts in the household and the community, in common with, I think, very, very many human societies. So modern medical practice and procedure was coming into rural spaces in the late imperial period, and there were increasing kind of interventions from Western trained medical experts, whether it's about practices of birth or about welfare and well-being. And if you're interested in that, I would urge you to look at Bulgakov's extraordinary book called The Country Doctor's Notebook, where Bulgakov was trained as a doctor, and he went in 1914 to what he describes as the deepest, darkest Russian village, and he there describes his encounters with folk medicine and his desperate attempts to inculcate some modern medical practice in the countryside, and the resistance that he faces. So that's where I sort of point you to have a look at that. But yeah, there was folk practice. In terms of books, there was a very rapid spread of the written word. I've actually just recently written an article about books and reading in the countryside. I don't think I saw any references to medical textbooks. So that may not have been a dominant area, but it might just be something that didn't come up.
Brilliant, thank you. Well, we've only got a few minutes left. I'd love to put a question of my own to you. There's a few more left, so I'll throw some things at you, and then it's up to you entirely as to what you make of it all in the time we've got. My question is about change, really. You mentioned at the beginning that it's the 1860s onwards is a period of industrialization and urbanization. As a complete non-expert, I think of industrialization and not happening until the 1930s. So I mean, I'm more than happy to be wrong about that, but what it prompts me to ask is what kind of backdrop of change is there? And do you feel that you're observing change in the way that the elderly are being treated, or does it feel like a kind of a continuity, a traditional story? Is this a kind of a society that's in transition, or is it part of the kind of the old world order? And another question I'll just throw out to you from Jeff: what prompted you to study this depressing subject? So there we go, a couple of things for you to pick away at in your last few minutes.
Okay, so I'll deal with Jeff first. You know, I kind of, it's a depressing title, I will admit that. But I actually don't think it's depressing. I think it's extraordinary to try to think about the people on the edges of society. And I suppose that is what my entire scholarship has tried to do one way or another, and I've been interested in the edges, and this to me is very margin of society stuff. So it's sad, but it's so universal. You know, the experience of the challenge of care, of old age, of death. These are universal. So I think that they're meaningful questions, even if they're difficult questions. In answer to your question about change, and is this a society that is changing? I mean, it definitely is, but to try to quantify or qualify what social change feels like, looks like, what was happening before to what happens now, because there is no before, you know, that there is these kind of incremental shifts and changes over sustained periods. It is definitely the case that Russia went through this really pretty impressive boom of industrialization and urbanization from a very, very low level from the 1860s. So although that you're referring to the 30s as a period of extremely drastic and dramatic mass urbanization and industrialization, still what happens in the late 19th century is really significant. If you think about Russian cities in this period, just think New York, think Chicago. You know, that you're talking about very fast cities that have come up fast, that are filled with emigrants, but these emigrants have not come from outside the borders of the Russian Empire. The Russian Empire is a giant jurisdiction. It is large and complex. So whereas when we look at US cities, we see, you know, these very distinct, diverse groups coming from different parts of the globe with their own distinct communities. In Russian cities, we have the imperial melting pot of different parts of the empire feeding these big urban spaces. I am uncomfortable about answering, you know, is the care for old people, is this a continuity or a change? My gut feeling is that it's a continuity, but that there will be areas of significant change, and particularly in relation to, I haven't had a chance to talk about it today, but particularly in relation to migrant labourers and to the status of returners, people who spent probably most of their lives in urban spaces and then return to the village at the end of their lives. This is, you know, it's another, but I suppose I think that societies are constantly in flux. They're constantly shifting and changing. And so therefore it is very difficult to mark off a point of something new, unless you have a massive political revolution, and then you have a point, right?
Yeah. Thank you so much. And, you know, to close up and just say again, Sarah, what an absolutely fantastic paper. And to pick up on that final point you made about the depressing subject and looking at the margins in order to think about something more significant and that's not marginal. I really can't think of how you could better have demonstrated how a historian can take something that's small and marginal and really say something very big and very interesting. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to you and to speak with you about your research. Thank you very much. I see people clapping in the audience.
Oh, that's very nice. I like that.
Exactly. Thank
it's exciting, isn't it? Thank you so much for inviting me, and thank you to all those people who are in the audience. I can't see you, but I hope that I offered you some interesting questions, and yeah, thank you very much.
Sarah, thank you. You really did. I will just close out by providing our audience with a little bit of information about our next upcoming events. And we have a panel discussion considering the life, work and legacy of the historian and politician Eric Williams, best known for his classic study of capitalism slavery, which was published all the way back in 1944. And that's taking place online on Wednesday, the 15th of March. We also have an in-person conference, one-day conference, History, Archives in Practice, taking place in conjunction with the National Archives and the Institute of Historical Research. It will be held at the Institute of Historical Research on Wednesday, the 29th of March. And our next lecture in this series is going to take place on Friday, the 5th of May, or being well, that will be held in person at UCL. And you can find more details about all of these events and how to book, and indeed how to get involved in the work of the Society by looking at our website. Thank you all very much for being here this evening. Thanks again to Sarah, and hopefully see you at an RHS event again soon.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Right,
Bye-bye.
good evening.